When I opened the small velvet box tucked deep inside my jewelry drawer, I wasn't looking for anything specific. I just wanted to feel something. The cold metal of that bracelet brushed against my fingers, and I paused, not because it was beautiful, but because it wasn't supposed to be there. It wasn't a gift from my husband. It wasn't tied to any anniversary or holiday. It came from a moment I wasn't ready to admit had happened. As I lifted it to the light, the soft shimmer seemed to mock me, reminding me of the day I first wore it, and who fastened it onto my wrist. My breath caught. I could still feel the way his fingers had lingered, the way his eyes had held mine a second too long. That look, I can't forget it. And I haven't even told you the worst part yet. It wasn't just a bracelet. It was a key. To something I never meant to open. To a door I told myself didn't exist. But I stepped through anyway. Before I explain how everything unraveled, and why I can't go back, tell me in the comments, have you ever been tempted by something you knew could destroy everything? And did you give in? I remember the invitation sitting on the counter for days before I finally picked it up. The handwriting on the front was instantly familiar, a little crooked, full of warmth, just like her. My best friend from college, the one who always knew how to make a Tuesday feel like a celebration, was throwing a dinner party for her birthday. Just a few of us, the note said. Nothing fancy. Bring wine. Bring stories. I stared at it for a while, then tucked it under a pile of bills. I didn't think about it again until my husband asked why I'd been so quiet over dinner. We weren't unhappy, exactly. But we weren't much of anything. We moved through our routines like seasoned actors on stage, competent, practiced, detached. There was no passion, but no real argument either. Just the slow erosion of attention. Like water on stone, it wore us down without making a sound. When I finally decided to go, I didn't tell him right away. He had a conference that weekend, and I figured it would be easier to slip away without explanation. Not because I was hiding anything. At least, that's what I told myself. The night of the party, I took longer than usual getting ready. I stood in front of the mirror with a strange sense of indecision. Everything I tried on felt like a costume, too formal, too plain, too loud. Eventually, I settled on something soft, neutral, understated. I told myself I wasn't dressing for anyone. Her house hadn't changed much. The garden still smelled of rosemary and wild lavender. The front door still squeaked. When she opened it, we hugged the way old friends do, full-bodied, nostalgic, aware of everything we'd survived. The dinner table was set with mismatched plates and tall candles, laughter echoing from the kitchen. I saw a few familiar faces from the past, people I hadn't thought about in years. And then I saw him. He walked in from the patio with a tray of drinks and a quiet confidence that unsettled me. Broad shoulders, that effortless stride. And those eyes. He had his mother's mouth, but his father's gaze, unflinching, direct. I recognized him before I wanted to. Her son. I'd last seen him when he was barely out of high school, all limbs and awkwardness. Now, he was a man. And he looked at me like he knew I'd be caught off guard. We exchanged polite greetings. A kiss on the cheek. A look at you from me. You haven't changed from him that made my stomach flutter more than it should have. Throughout the evening, I felt his presence like a current. Not overt, not aggressive. Just there. He asked thoughtful questions. Laughed at the right moments. Held eye contact a second longer than necessary. I caught myself watching him when I shouldn't have been. At one point, while the others were busy in the kitchen, we found ourselves alone near the bookshelf. I remember this house being bigger, he said softly. Everything seems bigger when you're small, I replied, surprised at the intimacy in my own voice. There was a pause, long enough to be meaningful. Then someone called for him, and the spell broke. I left earlier than planned. Claimed an early morning, a long drive. She walked me to the door, full of wine and joy, and kissed me on both cheeks. As I reached my car, I heard footsteps behind me. "Wait," he said. I turned. He was holding something small in his hand, a black, simple velvet box. "You dropped this inside," he said, offering it to me. I took it, confused. "I don't think." "Maybe not tonight," he interrupted. "Maybe later." He smiled, not with his mouth, but with something deeper. And walked away before I could ask another word. I drove home in silence. The roads were empty, and so was I. When I finally parked, I sat in the driveway for a long time, staring at the box. Inside was a bracelet, delicate, silver, understated. Not flashy. Not romantic. But unmistakably intentional. I didn't tell my husband. I didn't tell anyone. I told myself it was nothing. But that night, I placed it on my wrist, just to see how it looked. It stayed there until morning. The bracelet was still on my wrist when I made coffee the next morning. My husband didn't notice. He rarely did. He was halfway through an email, muttering something about a budget report, while I stood across from him, feeling like I'd stolen something. And maybe I had. Not the bracelet itself, that had been given. But the moment, the intention, the tension I had allowed to grow inside me. I told myself I would take it off. After breakfast, before my shower, before the guilt settled too deep. But I didn't. Instead, I covered it with the sleeve of my cardigan, as if hiding it from the world would make it less real. As if it hadn't already marked me in ways I didn't want to admit. My phone buzzed while I was folding laundry. Just a simple message. "Coffee sometime?" No name. No emojis. Nothing flirtatious. But my breath still hitched when I read it. I didn't answer right away. I stared at the screen, wondering what would happen if I replied. Wondering what it meant that I wanted to. I deleted the message. Then, an hour later, I rewrote it from memory and replied. Maybe. It was days before we saw each other again. I found myself rearranging errands so I would be near that little cafe downtown, the one tucked between a bookstore and a florist. I convinced myself it was just coincidence. That if he happened to be there, it wouldn't mean anything. But of course, he was there. Sitting at an outdoor table, coffee in hand, as if he'd been waiting. I froze for a moment before walking over. He smiled, stood, and pulled out a chair. Too polite. Too intentional. He didn't comment on the bracelet, though I saw his eyes flick toward it. That small glance was louder than any words. The conversation started innocently. Work, weather, the latest city construction. He asked about my husband, my routines, what I did to feel alive lately. The question lingered between us like steam from the mugs. I hesitated before answering. I wasn't sure how much of the truth I was allowed to say out loud. I said finally. I walk. I used to garden, but I don't know. I guess I stopped. He nodded, then leaned in just slightly. You don't sound very alive when you say that. I blinked, caught off guard. Not by the words, but by how accurately they cut through the polite surface I'd built around myself. He didn't elaborate. Just sipped his drink and let the silence sit. When I stood to leave, he didn't reach for me. Didn't say anything. But something in his expression said, I see you. And I hated how much I wanted to be seen. I didn't tell anyone about that meeting. Not even my journal, which I hadn't touched in years. Writing it down would make it real. So I kept it in my body, the way my hands trembled as I folded napkins, the heat in my face when I heard a text notification, the weight of my own silence. The next invitation came casually. A text on a Sunday afternoon, "You ever go to the sculpture park anymore?" He didn't ask to meet. He didn't suggest a time. Just placed the idea in front of me, like a seed. I ignored it at first. Then, on Tuesday, I found myself parking near the entrance without planning it. The park was mostly empty. Late autumn had stripped the trees bare, and the sculptures stood like forgotten sentinels among the leaves. I walked slowly, unsure if he was even there. Unsure if I wanted him to be. He appeared near the third exhibit, a twisted steel structure meant to resemble falling. We both paused, facing it together without speaking. "It looks different in the cold," he said eventually. "So do people," I replied. We walked in silence for a while. The path curved and narrowed, leading us away from the main road. I was suddenly aware of every step, every breath. The air between us pulsed with unsaid things. Then he stopped. Looked at me. No smile. Just a steady, calm gaze. "You can tell me to stop," he said quietly. My throat tightened. I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't need to. And I didn't stop him. We kissed. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't messy or dramatic. It was a moment, sharp, real, irreversible. And when we parted, neither of us apologized. I walked away first. My legs felt shaky, my hands ice cold. I didn't look back, didn't check if he followed. I needed space, not from him, but from the part of myself I'd just met. The part that had waited patiently beneath years of routine, of silence, of being fine. That night, I set the bracelet on the bathroom counter and stared at it while brushing my teeth. My husband knocked on the door. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," I called back. "Just tired." He went to bed early. I stayed up, reading articles I didn't finish, scrolling past photos I didn't really see. At some point, I put the bracelet back on. The next day, I passed by my reflection and saw something new in my face. Not guilt. Not regret. Something closer to recognition. As if I was finally seeing who I had become, not who I had promised to be. And in that recognition, there was both terror and freedom. I didn't expect to be invited again so soon, but the message came 2 days later. It was from her, my old friend, the mother. She was hosting a small dinner, just a few of us from the other night, something informal, she said. Her tone was light, but underneath, I sensed something else. Maybe she noticed something that evening. Maybe she hadn't. Either way, the invitation unsettled me. I stared at it for hours before replying. My fingers hovered over the keyboard too long. I typed, erased, retyped, and finally settled on a nonchalant "I'd love to." And then I hated myself for how much I meant it. That whole day, I moved through my routines like a woman watching herself from the outside. Laundry, errands, lunch, it all felt shallow, distant. The only thing that felt real was the flutter of nerves every time I imagined seeing him again. I wasn't supposed to feel this way. Not at this age. Not with the life I'd built. But the more I denied it, the more vivid it became. The evening came quicker than I expected. I stood in my closet, overwhelmed by the ridiculousness of the moment. I was dressing for dinner with my friend, and yet every decision felt like it was for someone else entirely. I didn't want to look too obvious. But I also didn't want to disappear. In the end, I chose a soft burgundy blouse, simple black pants, and earrings I hadn't worn in years. Nothing flashy. Just enough. When I arrived, the house was already buzzing. Candles lit. Music low. The kind of warm, curated messiness that makes people feel comfortable. She greeted me with a hug and a smile, asked about my week, poured me wine. It was also normal that it made me feel guilty for how abnormal I felt inside. I told myself I wouldn't seek him out. That I'd be polite, gracious, indifferent. But the second I stepped into the room and saw him leaning against the kitchen counter, glass in hand, talking to someone with that relaxed ease, my breath caught. He looked up. Our eyes met. No smile. No nod. Just the kind of pause that felt like a thread being pulled tight between us. Dinner was served buffet style. We gathered plates, exchanged pleasantries, laughed at old stories. He sat at the other end of the table, talking with her neighbor about travel or music or something else that didn't involve me. And yet I felt him. Every shift, every glance, every silence he left hanging in the air, it was all laced with something unspoken. I tried to focus on the conversation beside me. Her husband was telling a story about a weekend hike gone wrong. People laughed. I forced a smile. But my thoughts kept drifting, pulled back like a tide. Dessert came and went. People began to loosen. The music changed. Some left early. Others stayed, drifting into different rooms, into the kitchen for more wine, out onto the patio for air. I found myself standing in the hallway, staring at a framed photo of us from college, her and me, arms slung around each other, youthful and unguarded. You haven't changed much, a voice said behind me. I turned. It was him. Too close. Too calm. I don't believe that, I said, quieter than I intended. He shrugged. Maybe not on the outside. But something else, you still hold yourself the same way. What way is that? He looked at me then, not just casually, intently. Like you're waiting for permission to want something. The words landed heavy. Not like a flirtation. Like a truth I didn't want anyone else to see in me. I stepped back, needing air. I found the patio empty, quiet. The night had cooled, and the string lights cast a gentle glow over the garden. I stood near the edge, wine glass in hand, listening to my own heartbeat. A moment later, he joined me. Not too close. Not too far. The space between us was deliberate. Neither of us spoke for a while. I shouldn't be here, I said finally. But you are. I didn't know what I expected him to say. Maybe denial, maybe reassurance. But he offered none of that. I keep thinking about the park, he continued. How quiet it was. How still you were afterward. I looked down at the bracelet. My fingers grazed it, almost involuntarily. It's just a bracelet. He shook his head gently. No. It's not. I didn't argue. Because he was right. It wasn't just a bracelet. It was a choice I hadn't acknowledged yet. A turning point pretending to be jewelry. Voices behind us broke the silence. We stepped apart without touching, like two people returning to their separate stages. Inside, people were putting on coats, saying goodbyes. She hugged me at the door, thanked me for coming, said we should catch up more often. I nodded, offered a hollow promise. As I stepped into the night, I heard steps behind me. I'll walk you to your car, he said. It wasn't a question. We walked in silence down the driveway. The air between us thick with everything we didn't say. When we reached my car, I turned. This has to stop. He nodded. It can. But it won't, I said. And I hated how honest I was. He didn't reply. Just looked at me for a long moment, then stepped back. I got in, started the engine, drove away. But all the way home, I could still feel his gaze like a hand between my shoulder blades, steady, impossible to ignore. That night, I placed the bracelet on the nightstand instead of my wrist. I told myself it was progress. But even as I turned off the light, my fingers reached for it again. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. The house was still. My husband's quiet breathing filled the bedroom, a steady rhythm that should have brought me peace. Instead, it made my chest tighten. I lay there in the half-dark, watching the ceiling, counting the lines in the plaster like I used to count stars when I was a child, desperate for distraction, for stillness, for something beyond myself. I didn't touch the bracelet right away. It lay there on the nightstand, catching faint light from the window. I tried not to look at it. Tried to convince myself it didn't matter. That the previous night had been just another dinner party, just a coincidence, just nothing. But denial is a fragile structure. It doesn't take much for it to collapse. By noon, I found myself driving aimlessly. I told my husband I was running errands. He nodded without looking up from his laptop. Work had consumed him lately, and in that vacuum of attention, I had drifted further away. Maybe we both had. And maybe that should have scared me more than it did. I ended up downtown without intending to. The familiar streets wrapped around me like an old coat I hadn't realized I still owned. I parked near the bookstore I used to visit on weekends. The place where I once believed solitude was a kind of strength, not a sign of what I'd lost. I didn't expect to see him. I told myself that. But as I walked past the cafe across the street, I paused. He was there. Sitting alone at a table outside, reading something, a novel, maybe, or a journal. He didn't notice me at first, and I could have kept walking. Could have ducked into the next shop and disappeared into my carefully constructed normal. But I didn't. He looked up. Our eyes met. A flicker of surprise, then calm. No smile. Just recognition. I walked toward him without speaking, as though pulled by gravity. He didn't stand this time. Just gestured toward the empty chair across from him. I sat. We didn't speak right away. The quiet between us wasn't uncomfortable. It was loaded. Every breath, every blink, seemed to ask a question we weren't ready to answer. Finally, he closed the book. You came. I didn't mean to, I replied, though we both knew that wasn't true. He nodded. Still wearing it? I looked down. The bracelet was hidden beneath the cuff of my sleeve, but I didn't need to check. I always knew when it was there. I wasn't going to, I said. But I couldn't take it off. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. The understanding was already there, resting in the space between us like a weight. We sat like that for a long while. Watching the street. Listening to the sounds of the city, laughter from a nearby table, the distant whir of a bus, the scrape of chairs on pavement. Life happening all around us, while we hovered in a bubble just outside of it. Eventually, I asked him something I hadn't meant to. Why me? He looked at me, not surprised. Because you were the only one who ever seemed to be, somewhere else. I didn't understand. Or maybe I did, and I didn't want to admit it. He leaned forward slightly. When I was younger, you always seemed like you had another life inside you. Like you were living two at once. One you showed to everyone, and one you never did. His words unsettled me. Not because they were unkind. But because they were true. I've tried to forget it, I said, softer now. Tried to let it go. And how's that going? We both smiled, though there was no humor in it. I left soon after. I told him I needed to go. He didn't ask where. He just watched me walk away. And this time, I didn't look back. But I didn't go home. Instead, I drove. Past neighborhoods I hadn't visited in years. past empty fields, quiet parks, old buildings that had once held meaning. I kept driving until I reached the lake. The one where we used to take day trips when we were newly married, before the routines calcified, before the silences deepened. I sat on a bench overlooking the water, the bracelet cold against my skin. The air smelled like damp leaves and faint smoke, the scent of autumn leaning into winter. I thought about calling someone. Not him. Not my husband. Just someone. But there was no one I could say these things to. No language for this kind of ache. Instead, I wrote. I pulled a crumpled receipt from my bag, found a pen, and began scribbling phrases. Fragments. Thoughts I hadn't let myself speak aloud. I don't know who I am when no one's looking. I forgot what desire feels like without guilt. I want to be touched, not managed. I'm afraid to be seen, but more afraid of being invisible. The ink smudged as I wrote. The wind picked up, catching the edge of the paper, but I pressed it down, like a secret I wasn't ready to release. By the time I got home, it was dark. My husband was on the couch, watching something on his tablet. He looked up, briefly. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Fine," I said. "Just needed a day." He nodded. "Leftovers in the fridge." "Thanks." We didn't say much else. Later, in bed, he reached for me. Out of routine, not desire. And I let him. Because it was easier than explaining why I felt so far away, even lying next to him. As he slept, I turned toward the wall, fingers brushing the bracelet again. I knew I should take it off. But I didn't. Because it reminded me of something I hadn't felt in years. And I wasn't ready to forget. I thought that putting distance between us would help. That time, silence, and the repetition of ordinary days would dull whatever had ignited between us. I threw myself into routine like a person clinging to a raft in rough water. Grocery lists, laundry, calendar reminders, phone calls I'd postponed, everything became a shield. But nothing truly kept the thoughts away. One afternoon, my husband suggested we take a trip to the cabin. It wasn't really a cabin, just a modest house we owned near the hills, used mostly in summer. He said it would be nice to disconnect, to breathe different air, to recharge. I agreed, maybe too quickly, hoping the change of scenery might allow me to reset everything. A quiet weekend in nature. No city distractions. Just him and me. We packed on Friday. The drive was long but uneventful. He talked about projects at work, plans for renovations, a friend who'd moved out of state. I nodded in all the right places. My responses were automatic, the kind that don't come from thought but from habit. When we arrived, I opened the windows first. The air inside was stale, scented faintly with old wood and dust. As I walked through the rooms, memories tugged at me. Summers spent reading on the porch, wine on chilly nights, hikes that left us breathless and laughing. It used to feel like ours. But that feeling had faded somewhere along the way. The first evening passed in a blur of simplicity. Dinner. A walk around the property. He built a fire while I curled up with a book I couldn't focus on. We sat together in silence, the kind that had long since lost its intimacy. That night, I stared at the ceiling for hours. He slept soundly beside me. I turned onto my side, facing the wall, my hand resting over the bracelet beneath my sleeve. I hadn't taken it off. Not even here. The next morning, while he went into town to pick up supplies, I wandered the nearby trail alone. The air was crisp, full of pine and silence. My thoughts echoed louder in that kind of quiet. Every step felt like a confession. I needed this walk to clear my head, to reclaim some sense of balance. My phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. I hesitated before pulling it out. A message. Short. No greeting. I'm nearby. I stopped walking. I read it again. Then a second message. Just passing through. Thought about you. I didn't respond. I didn't move. I stood there on the edge of the trail, staring into the trees, my heart beating in my ears. He wasn't asking for anything. Not directly. He never did. That was what made it worse. He just existed, present, undeniable, and waiting for me to choose. I turned back toward the house. My feet moved quickly, crunching leaves and small branches beneath them. My mind raced. I didn't know what I was doing, only that I had to do something. My husband was still gone when I returned. I checked the time. 40 minutes, maybe more, before he would be back. I went to the garage. It was mostly empty, a few chairs, old tools, and the picnic table we rarely used. I stood there for a moment, hands in my coat pockets, unsure of what I was expecting. Then I heard it, the soft hum of an engine rolling slowly down the dirt road, tires against gravel. My breath caught. I stepped outside. He was there. Windows down, one hand on the steering wheel. He didn't smile. He just looked at me like I was the only person who had ever made him pause. I didn't speak. I walked toward the car. He got out. There were only a few feet between us now, but they felt like a canyon. No words. No questions. We stood there, the cold air folding around us. And then, we kissed. Not rushed. Not desperate. Just inevitable. It happened in silence. A pause that turned into an answer. We kissed. And then it was over. He stepped back. I did too. I didn't ask why he'd come. I didn't ask how he knew. Some things don't need explanation when they're already felt. He nodded once, then turned back to the car. No goodbye. No drama. Just the soft thud of the door closing and the quiet roll of tires as he disappeared down the path. I stood there long after the sound faded. When my husband returned, I was sitting on the porch with a cup of tea I hadn't touched. Everything all right? He asked, unloading the bags. Fine, I said. I just needed some air. He didn't question it. That night, we played cards by the fire, like we used to. He joked about my bad poker face. I laughed, or something close to it. The room felt warmer than it had in years. But I knew it wasn't the fire. It was the storm quietly brewing inside me. Later, as I lay in bed beside him, I replayed the moment over and over. The quiet intensity. The stillness. The way it didn't feel like cheating, not in the traditional sense, but something far more intimate. A surrender I didn't know I was capable of. I thought I'd feel guilt. Shame. Panic. But what I felt was clarity. I had crossed a line. And I couldn't pretend otherwise. Back home, everything felt heavier. The air in the house seemed thicker, as if the walls were aware of what had happened, and were holding their breath, waiting to see what I'd do next. I moved through the rooms more slowly, noticing details I'd long stopped seeing, the scuff on the baseboard in the hallway, the stack of magazines I hadn't read in months, the faint crack in the living room window that always caught the morning light. None of it had changed, but I had. My husband was in the kitchen, unloading groceries. He greeted me with a smile, offered a comment about how quiet the cabin had been this time, how nice it was to disconnect. I nodded, said something polite in return, and went to the bedroom under the pretense of unpacking. But really, I needed to be alone. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my reflection in the mirror across the room. I didn't look different. No one would be able to tell, just by glancing at me, that I had stepped across a boundary I once thought sacred. My expression was calm, my posture composed. But under the surface, something had shifted. Something irreversible. Later that evening, I tried to lose myself in tasks. I reorganized the spice drawer. I dusted the bookshelves. I cleaned the bathroom sink twice. But nothing settled me. My thoughts moved in loops, always returning to that moment by the cabin. The stillness of it. The finality. It wasn't just the kiss. It was what it meant. I had said yes, not with words, but with action. And I couldn't take it back. The following days passed in a fog. I went to work. I smiled when I was supposed to. I answered questions, returned emails, followed my schedule. No one noticed anything wrong. That was the most terrifying part, how easy it was to keep the truth hidden, how good I had become at wearing my mask. At home, things continued as usual. My husband was attentive in his way, checking the thermostat, making sure the car tires were properly inflated, asking if I wanted to try a new place for dinner next weekend. All the small efforts that had once made me feel secure, now felt like routines practiced out of obligation. I couldn't talk to him about what I felt. I wasn't sure I could even explain it to myself. There wasn't a single moment when things had gone wrong between us. No betrayal, no fight, no cruelty. Just years of slow erosion, of becoming strangers in the same house. One afternoon, while sorting through a box of old receipts and paperwork, I found a photograph. It had been taken at a barbecue, maybe 6 or 7 years ago. We were both in it, standing side by side. I was laughing, head tilted back slightly, eyes closed. He was looking at me, not smiling, just watching me. I studied that photo for a long time. There had been a time when we were still connected. When that look meant something deeper. But now, it felt like a memory that didn't quite belong to me anymore. That night, I lay awake long after he had fallen asleep. I watched the ceiling shift in shadows, listened to the sounds of the house at rest. I thought about the moment at the cabin again, the silence before the kiss, the way he looked at me like I was something rare, not routine. The next morning, I received a package in the mail. No return address. Just my name, written in handwriting I immediately recognized. Inside was a small envelope. No note. Just a photograph, a candid shot of me taken from a distance, standing at the edge of the lake near the cabin. I was alone, arms crossed, looking out over the water. On the back, one sentence, "You looked like you belonged to no one but yourself." I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, holding that photograph. My fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the way the words reached into something raw inside me. I didn't know how he had taken it. Or why he sent it. But it didn't feel like a gesture of romance. It felt like a reminder of who I had been in that moment. Of what I had allowed myself to feel. I placed the photo inside a drawer, hidden beneath a stack of recipe cards I hadn't touched in years. That evening, I dressed for dinner with friends. An ordinary night, with ordinary people, in an ordinary restaurant. But as I got ready, I noticed the way I checked my reflection more carefully. The way I selected my earrings with intention. The way I adjusted my blouse not for comfort, but for presence. At the restaurant, I laughed at the right jokes. I made conversation. I played the part. But something in me had changed. I wasn't pretending anymore. I wasn't trying to return to the person I had been before. Back home, as I undressed and placed the bracelet gently into its small dish on the nightstand, I realized I no longer wore it for the memory of him. I wore it because of what it meant to me. Not the kiss. Not the risk. But the awakening. The sense that I was still capable of feeling something unexpected. Something vivid. Lying in bed, I turned toward my husband. He was already asleep, his face softened in rest. I watched him for a moment, wondering what he would say if he knew. If he ever could know. If I would ever tell him. But I didn't speak. I turned back toward the ceiling and closed my eyes. And for the first time in weeks, I dreamed of nothing. The first thing I noticed when I woke that morning was the quiet. Not the usual household quiet, but a deeper kind, the kind that feels like something is waiting. My husband had already left for a weekend conference out of town. He kissed my forehead before leaving, still half asleep. I remember murmuring something in return, not quite conscious. Now, the house felt like it belonged to no one. The silence wasn't empty, it was vast. I made coffee without rushing, listening to the hum of the machine. The morning light was soft through the windows, painting long, gentle lines across the tile floor. There was no need to check my calendar. No appointments, no meetings. A full day stretched in front of me like a blank page, which would have felt peaceful once. But now, it felt charged. There was a note by the coffee machine. Just a few words in his handwriting, the kind that always leaned slightly to the right. Don't forget to water the plants. Be back late Sunday. Love you. I stared at it longer than necessary. Folded it. Slipped it into the pocket of my robe. And then I turned off my phone. I didn't want to hear it ring. I didn't want to see any name on the screen, not his, not anyone's. It wasn't until after lunch that I finally opened the drawer where I'd placed the photo. The one he'd sent. I looked at it again, slower this time, studying every detail, my posture, the distance in my gaze, the stillness. I hadn't realized I looked that alone. Or that grounded. It made me feel something hard to name, like strength and sadness intertwined. I stood by the window for a long time after that, watching the street. I wasn't waiting. Not really. But my body stayed alert, like it already knew something my mind hadn't decided. Around 4, I went to the bedroom and changed clothes. I didn't choose anything dramatic. A long gray sweater, soft jeans, flats. Nothing too deliberate. But I lingered over the bracelet. I put it on without hesitation. I left a lamp on in the hallway and made sure the door was unlocked. It felt too deliberate, and yet not deliberate enough. Then I sat on the couch, the television on low, my legs tucked underneath me. The coffee I made had gone cold hours before. The knock at the door came just before dusk. Not loud. Not urgent. Just a quiet signal that what I had not said yes to, but also never said no to, was standing outside. I opened the door slowly. He was there, hands in his pockets, eyes calm. No smile. No words. I stepped aside, and he walked in. I closed the door behind him. We didn't speak. I didn't ask why he came. He didn't ask if he was welcome. It was understood. Everything had been leading to this moment. We moved through the house as if we'd both been there 100 times. Like the walls already recognized him. Like my hands knew where his belonged. I led him to the guest room. We spent the night together. That sentence doesn't need embellishment. It doesn't ask for details. It was not a moment of passion stolen in the dark. It was something quieter. Something heavier. Like stepping into water you know is too deep, and walking in anyway. I woke before him. For a moment, I just watched him sleep. His chest rising and falling, his fingers curled loosely near his face. He looked young. Not in a childish way, but in a way that made me ache. There was still softness in him, still possibility. Things I hadn't felt in myself for years. I stood and left the room quietly, walking barefoot through the house. The morning light was just beginning to return, brushing against the walls like a cautious visitor. I poured a glass of water and sat by the kitchen window, listening to the faint ticking of the clock above the stove. I didn't feel regret. Not in the way I expected. What I felt was more complicated, like I had finally stepped into alignment with a version of myself I had been denying for far too long. I wasn't proud of it. But I wasn't ashamed either. It just was. He left without a scene. No prolonged goodbye. No declarations. Just a quiet exit, like someone who knew the moment couldn't be extended, only carried. After he was gone, I changed the sheets. Not because I wanted to erase it, but because it felt necessary. Like closing a chapter, even if the story wasn't finished. The house returned to stillness. But now, it was a different kind of quiet. Not the waiting kind. The kind that comes after something has finally happened. After the line has been crossed, and you realize you are still standing, but never where you were before. That afternoon, I reopened my phone and read through old texts. His name was still there, threaded between days and moments. I didn't delete them. But I didn't reply to anything either. I took the bracelet off that evening, placed it on the bathroom counter, and walked away. Not because I was done. But because I needed to remember how it felt to choose, not to be pulled. I looked at myself in the mirror, searching for signs of what had changed. My reflection looked back with the same eyes, same lines, same familiar sadness tucked just beneath the skin. But something inside had settled. Something had finally found its voice. And I wasn't ready to silence it again. When Sunday evening came, the house felt like it had folded itself back into place, as if nothing had shifted inside it. My husband returned just before dark, suitcase in hand, jacket still dusted with the smell of a different town. I met him at the door with a tired smile, not forced, but quieter than usual. He kissed my cheek and murmured something about traffic. I nodded, helped him carry in his bag, and asked how the conference went. His answer was a list of speakers I didn't recognize and seminars I barely followed. I listened anyway. We ate takeout at the kitchen table. The same table I'd wiped down that morning with deliberate care, as if cleanliness could absolve anything. He talked more than usual, which surprised me. Not about anything important, but still, his voice filled the air in a way that made the silence of the previous day feel even louder in contrast. I responded where I needed to. I smiled where I should. I didn't stumble. After dinner, he settled into the couch with his laptop. I stood for a while by the sink, looking out the window into the dark. The sky was clear. No clouds. No rain. But I felt something heavy pressing behind my ribs, something I couldn't name. Not grief. Not guilt. Something more like the weight of having known too much in too short a time. In the bedroom later, as he unpacked, I noticed how normal it all was. His folded shirts. The socks he rolled with care. The sound of drawers opening and closing. I watched him move around the room, his back to me, and for a second I saw it, the life we had built brick by brick, year by year. Safe. Predictable. Ours. But it wasn't enough anymore. That realization didn't come with drama. It came quietly, like a truth I had always known but hadn't been brave enough to say out loud. We didn't speak much that night. He was tired. I pretended to be. When he reached for me in the dark, I let him hold me. I didn't pull away. But I didn't lean in either. I just stayed still, my body present but my mind far away. The next morning, he left early for work. I sat in bed after the door closed, sunlight spilling across the sheets, illuminating everything in soft gold. The bracelet was still on the bathroom counter, where I had left it. I didn't touch it. Not yet. Instead, I moved slowly through the day. I did laundry. I cleaned out the refrigerator. I rearranged the spices alphabetically, something I hadn't done in years. I felt a strange pull toward order. As if tidying the surface could settle the storm within. In the afternoon, I went to the mailbox and found a single postcard inside. No envelope. Just a photo of a street in Rome, cobblestone, a small cafe, sunlight hitting the shuttered windows at an angle that made everything glow. On the back, only a few words, "You looked free." No name. No signature. But I knew who it was from. I stared at the image for a long time. I traced the edges with my thumb, reading and rereading the message until the letters felt etched into my skin. Then I slid it into the back of a book I kept on the shelf by my nightstand. A book I hadn't opened in years. That night, I didn't sleep well. My dreams were fragmented. People I hadn't seen in years appeared and disappeared in flashes, laughter without sound, doors that opened into unfamiliar rooms. I woke several times, heart racing, not from fear, but from the confusion of being pulled between worlds. The next few days passed in a rhythm that felt almost like peace. But it was a careful peace, one that required maintenance. I kept conversations with my husband light, stayed out longer than usual during errands, and checked my phone less. I didn't hear from him, not a message, not a call. And yet, I felt his presence, as though some invisible thread still stretched between us, taut but unbroken. On Thursday, I visited my old friend. The one whose son had become the axis around which my world quietly tilted. She welcomed me with a warm smile and 2 mugs of tea already prepared, like she had been expecting me long before I texted. We sat in her kitchen, sunlight slanting through the blinds, the smell of something sweet baking in the oven. She asked about my week, about work, about whether I'd finally gotten around to repainting the guest room like I'd once mentioned. I answered honestly, or at least half-honestly. I told her about errands, about a recipe I'd tried and failed, about the conference my husband had attended. I kept my voice steady. My hands wrapped tightly around the warm mug to hide the way they trembled. Then she said something that made my chest clench. "He said you looked beautiful the other night." I blinked, unsure I had heard correctly. "My son," she added, with a soft laugh. "He told me you hadn't changed. That you had a grace about you." I didn't know what to say. So I smiled. That safe, practiced smile that I had used 1,000 times before. She didn't seem to notice my silence. Or if she did, she let it pass without question. Instead, she moved on to talk about a trip she was planning. Some getaway with old friends. She asked if I'd be interested in joining, said it might be good for both of us. I nodded vaguely. Said I'd think about it. On the drive home, my thoughts spun. His words, passed through her, lodged somewhere deep. Not because of what they meant, but because of what they confirmed. He was still there, just beyond the periphery, watching quietly. When I got home, I went straight to the bedroom and opened the book where I had hidden the postcard. I took it out, traced the writing again. "You looked free." Then I walked to the mirror and stared at myself. Not the way I usually did, checking for flaws, signs of aging, the slow erosion of time. I looked for something deeper. For that freedom he claimed to see. I couldn't find it. Not fully. But I could feel it, like a whisper beneath the surface, waiting to be heard. That night, I placed the bracelet back on my wrist. Not out of habit, but as a reminder. A promise to myself that whatever came next, I wouldn't pretend anymore. Not with him. Not with my husband. Not with myself. Because silence had its own weight. And I was tired of carrying it alone. The postcard never left the book after that. I kept it there, pressed between yellowing pages I hadn't read in over a decade, like a folded piece of skin too delicate to touch. I knew exactly where it was, could picture the curve of the handwriting, the slant of the ink, but I didn't need to see it again. Its message had already imprinted itself inside me. I carried it around like a secret vow, invisible but heavy. Days moved in their usual fashion. Chores. Work. Dinner. The quiet companionship of a long marriage, functioning in sync but without spark. It became easier to navigate, somehow. Not because I had forgotten. Not because anything had healed. But because I no longer felt at war with the silence. And then one morning, while I was folding towels in the laundry room, my phone rang. His name didn't flash on the screen. It was her. His mother. My friend. She sounded cheerful, breezy, talking about lunch plans and an art fair downtown. I agreed to meet her. It felt strange to refuse. It would have raised more questions. Besides, some part of me wanted to see her, needed to be reminded that the world I had stepped into had once been a world I belonged to without hesitation. The cafe was crowded when I arrived, its tiny patio straining under the weight of late bloom flowers and too many customers. She waved me over from a corner table, already halfway through her iced tea. We talked like always, about her upcoming trip, the news, a mutual acquaintance who had moved to another state. I responded where I could, keeping my smile even, my tone balanced. But every word felt like walking a tightrope. Because I couldn't stop hearing his voice layered beneath hers, couldn't stop imagining what he had told her and what he hadn't. And then, as she stirred her tea, she said it. He left this morning. I blinked. Left? She nodded. Back to Europe. Didn't even tell me until last night. Said it was time? Time. The word landed hard in my chest. Not as a shock, something deeper than that. Like a door being closed softly behind you after you've already stepped through it. I nodded slowly, pretending to process the information like it was ordinary. Like it didn't matter. She reached across the table and touched my wrist. He asked me to give you something. I froze. What? She fished into her purse and handed me a small envelope. White. Plain. My name in that same handwriting, slanted and unassuming. She didn't linger, didn't ask questions, didn't smile. She just handed it to me and then began talking about something else, an upcoming renovation project, new curtains she was considering. As if she hadn't just passed me a grenade disguised as a goodbye. I didn't open it there. I couldn't. Instead, I slipped it into my bag and made it through the rest of lunch with carefully chosen phrases and a stillness I had spent months perfecting. When we hugged goodbye, her arms were warm and familiar. She held on just a moment longer than usual. I walked through the city for over an hour after that. Past storefronts I didn't look into. Past people I didn't register. The envelope felt like it pulsed in my bag with every step. When I got home, I stood in the hallway for a long time before taking it out. My fingers hesitated on the flap. I didn't know what I expected, some grand confession, some unraveling. Instead, what I found was quiet. A photograph. Just one. It was me, taken from behind. I was standing in my backyard, near the roses I had neglected all summer. The sun was setting. My hair was pulled up. My shoulders were bare. I was holding a watering can in one hand, and the other rested against the fence. I hadn't known I was being watched. On the back, one line. I left before you could ask me to stay. That was it. No name. No date. No apology. Just those words. A soft ending. I sat on the bed for a long time, holding the photo. My chest felt tight, but not from heartbreak. Something else. Something I hadn't prepared for. Relief. Not because he was gone, but because the story had finally folded itself closed. I didn't cry. I didn't rush to hide the picture. I just let it sit beside me, like a part of my life I had once touched and could now place down gently without shame. Later, I made dinner as usual. My husband came home, tired and distracted. He kissed my cheek and asked about my day. I told him I had lunch with her. He nodded and didn't press further. We ate in silence, forks clinking softly against plates. Afterward, he turned on the television, and I went into the bedroom. The bracelet was still on the dresser. I picked it up. Turned it in my hand. For a moment, I held it against my wrist, felt the coolness of the metal, the way it once signaled something secret and alive. But then, slowly, I placed it back into its box. Closed the lid. I wasn't erasing anything. I wasn't pretending it hadn't mattered. But I no longer needed to wear it to remember. I stepped outside onto the porch. The night air was sharp. Clean. I wrapped my arms around myself and looked up at the stars. I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't running either. Just still. Breathing. Knowing. And ready, at last, to move forward, not away from anything, but toward myself.